Priest touches dying boy in the hospital, and what happens terrifies everyone. In moments of despair and uncertainty, life can take unexpected turns. At a quiet hospital, a young boy lies on the brink of death, his family clinging to hope. A priest is called in to offer comfort, but what unfolds next is beyond anyone's imagination. This is a story of mystery, fear, and the extraordinary. Brace yourself for a story that will leave you questioning everything. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional hiss of the ventilator. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, lay motionless on the hospital bed, his pale face framed by a tangled mess of brown hair. His breaths were shallow, his chest rising and falling with labored effort, each moment seeming like a struggle against an unseen force. His parents, Sarah and Mark, stood on either side of the bed, their faces etched with despair, clutching his small, fragile hands as though their touch could tether him to life. The room smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of lavender, Sarah's last-ditch effort to mask the hospital's sterile atmosphere with some semblance of comfort. She had brought the boy's favorite stuffed animal, a ragged bear missing an eye, and placed it by his side. Mark stood stoically, though his trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes betrayed the turmoil within. Every breath the boy took seemed to echo their own pain, a shared agony that bound them in a way they had never imagined. Outside the room, nurses whispered in hushed tones, their faces grim. The prognosis was clear. There was little more that could be done. The boy's condition had worsened over the past week, and despite the doctor's best efforts, the disease had ravaged his body with an unrelenting ferocity. Mark had cornered the lead physician earlier that evening, pressing him for answers, for hope, for anything that could change the inevitable. But the doctor's response was a gentle yet firm shaking of his head, his words a death sentence that Mark could barely bring himself to repeat to Sarah. Inside the room, the weight of those words hung like a shadow. Sarah clung to her faith, whispering prayers under her breath, her voice cracking as she pleaded with a higher power. Please, please don't take him. Not yet, he's just a child. He's our baby. Her words trailed off into sobs, and Mark wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. They stood there in a moment of unity, drawing strength from each other as the unthinkable loomed closer. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, yet every second felt like a countdown. The dim overhead lights cast a pale glow on the boy's face, making him look almost otherworldly. A nurse entered quietly to check his vitals, her practiced hands moving efficiently as she adjusted the IV drip and recorded his oxygen levels. She avoided eye contact with the parents, knowing there was little comfort she could offer. Instead, she gave a soft nod before retreating back into the hallway, leaving the family alone once more. As the hours dragged on, the sense of finality grew stronger. Sarah and Mark exchanged glances, unspoken fears swirling between them. The boys' breaths were growing weaker, each one an effort that seemed to drain the life from him. Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank into the chair beside the bed, clutching his hand tightly. "He's going to pull through," she said aloud, as though saying it enough times would make it true. "He's a fighter. He's always been a fighter." Mark knelt beside her, resting his hand over hers. "I know," he replied, though his voice was hollow, the words more for her sake than his own. Deep down, he felt the same crushing hopelessness, the same sense that they were watching their world fall apart in slow motion. He stared at his son's face, memorizing every freckle, every strand of hair, as though he could preserve the image in his mind forever. Then came the knock at the door, a soft, hesitant sound that broke through the oppressive quiet. Both parents turned to see a nurse peeking in, her expression kind but cautious. "The priest is here," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like him to come in?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she looked at Mark, her eyes searching his for guidance. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Please, bring him in." The nurse disappeared, and moments later, an older man stepped into the room, dressed in a simple black cassock with a silver cross hanging around his neck. He carried himself with a quiet dignity. His face was weathered, lined with years of experience and compassion, and his kind eyes surveyed the scene before him. He took in the grieving parents, the frail boy, and the suffocating atmosphere of impending loss. "I'm Father Matthews," he said softly, stepping closer to the bed. His voice was calm, like a balm against the storm raging in the room. "I'm here to pray with you, to offer comfort in this difficult time." Sarah and Mark stood, their grief momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. Father Matthews approached the bed, his movements deliberate and reverent. He placed a hand on the boy's forehead, his touch gentle yet firm, and began to pray. His voice filled the room, steady and resonant, a mixture of Latin and English, weaving words of faith and solace. As he prayed, Sarah and Mark held each other tightly, their tears flowing freely. For the first time in hours, a sense of peace seemed to settle over the room. But it was a fragile peace, one that hung in the balance, waiting for what would come next. The call to Father Matthews had been made in the early hours of the evening, long after the doctors had delivered their final prognosis. The family's pastor, unable to leave town in time, had recommended Father Matthews, a priest known for his unwavering commitment to the community and his ability to bring comfort in the darkest of times. Though neither Sarah nor Mark had met him before, desperation left no room for hesitation. Any semblance of hope was welcome, no matter how small. Father Matthews arrived at the hospital just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and fiery orange. He stepped out of an aging sedan, the kind that had seen better years, and adjusted the silver cross around his neck before making his way through the hospital's sliding glass doors. Despite the rush of people around him, nurses hurrying to their stations, visitors pacing anxiously, he exuded a calm, unshakable presence, as though he carried within him a stillness that the world could not disturb. The nurse at the reception desk looked up as he approached, her eyes momentarily catching on the tired yet resolute expression on his face. "You're here for the Carter family?" she asked quietly, her tone laced with the kind of practiced gentleness reserved for the worst situations. Father Matthews nodded. "Yes, I was told their son is in critical condition." She hesitated, glancing down the hall. "He's not expected to make it through the night," she said softly, almost as if saying it aloud might seal the boy's fate. "The parents, they're struggling. They need someone to be with them." "I'll do what I can," the priest replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Where are they?" The nurse led him down a series of sterile, brightly lit hallways, her footsteps quick and purposeful. As they walked, Father Matthews observed the quiet chaos of the hospital around him. Patients in wheelchairs being escorted by orderlies, doctors consulting charts with grim expressions, the occasional echo of an overhead announcement. This was a place where life and death met in a constant, unrelenting dance, a battlefield where victories were hard-won and losses often overwhelming. Finally, they stopped outside a door with a small window, its glass obscured by a drawn curtain. The nurse gestured toward it, her face somber. "They're inside," she said. It's been a rough evening for them. The boy's been unresponsive for hours, and the parents, well, you'll see." Father Matthews nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, before stepping forward and knocking gently on the door. Inside, Sarah and Mark looked up at the sound. Their expressions, a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Sarah quickly wiped her tear-streaked face, trying to compose herself, while Mark instinctively straightened, his protective instincts kicking in. When the door opened and the priest stepped into the room, they both took in his presence with a kind of quiet relief. "I'm Father Matthews," he said, his voice low and steady as he offered a small, respectful bow of his head. "Your pastor asked me to come and be with you tonight." Sarah rose from her chair, clutching a crumpled tissue in one hand. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. We didn't know who else to call." "You made the right choice," he assured her, stepping closer to the bed. His eyes fell on the boy, and for a brief moment, his composed demeanor wavered. There was something about the child's fragile form, the unnatural stillness that seemed to envelop him, that struck a chord deep within the priest. He had seen death before, many times, but the sight of a child caught in its grip always felt like a personal wound. Mark stepped forward, extending a hand. "I'm Mark, and this is my wife, Sarah," he said. "Our son, his name is Ethan." Father Matthews took Mark's hand, shaking it firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, though I'm deeply sorry for the circumstances," he said. He turned to Sarah, offering her the same respectful handshake, though she hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling. "He's been like this for hours," Sarah said, motioning toward Ethan. Her voice cracked as she continued. "The doctors say there's nothing more they can do." The priest moved to the bedside, his expression unreadable as he studied Ethan's face. The boy's small frame was dwarfed by the hospital bed, his cheeks sunken and his skin alarmingly pale. Father Matthews reached out, gently placing his hand on the boy's forehead. His touch was tender, almost reverent, as though he were handling something sacred. "Tell me about him," he said softly, his eyes still on Ethan. "What kind of boy is he?" Sarah managed a small, bittersweet smile through her tears. He's full of life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or he was. He loves dinosaurs and superheroes. He's always been so curious about the world, always asking questions. He's such a bright, happy kid." Mark chimed in, his tone wistful. "He's the kind of kid who makes everyone around him smile. Even when he's sick, he never complains. He's special." Father Matthews nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their words. He knew he could never fully grasp the depth of their love or the magnitude of their loss, but he felt it nonetheless, a deep ache that resonated through him. "He sounds like an incredible child," he said, "and you've both been so strong for him." Sarah broke into fresh sobs, and Mark wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The priest gave them a moment, his hand still resting on Ethan's forehead. He closed his eyes briefly, uttering a silent prayer for strength for himself, for the parents, and for the boy who lay before him. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet determination. "I'd like to pray for Ethan," he said. "For him, for both of you, and for whatever lies ahead." Sarah and Mark nodded, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Father Matthews moved to the foot of the bed, clasping his hands together and bowing his head. The words of his prayer were soft but steady, filling the room with a sense of calm. As he spoke, the tension in the air seemed to ease, and for a brief moment, the world outside the hospital room faded away. But as the priest prayed, something unexplainable began to stir, a faint shift in the atmosphere that no one could ignore. The air in the room shifted subtly, at first barely noticeable, like the faintest whisper of a breeze. Father Matthews continued his prayer, his voice steady and unwavering, though his brow furrowed slightly as an unexpected chill crept through the air. Sarah, seated by Ethan's bedside, shivered and instinctively pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Mark noticed it too, glancing toward the vent above the door, wondering if the hospital's air conditioning had suddenly kicked into overdrive. But this wasn't a typical draft. It felt unnatural, carrying with it an almost tangible weight, as though the atmosphere itself were alive and watching. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered briefly, drawing a startled gasp from Sarah. Father Matthews paused for the briefest moment, his eyes snapping open and darting around the room, before resuming his prayer with renewed fervor. His voice grew louder, more commanding, as if he were challenging whatever presence had made itself known. As the priest's words filled the space, Ethan's heart monitor emitted a sharp, erratic beep. Sarah shot to her feet, her face pale with fear, and Mark leaned over their son, his voice trembling. "Ethan? Ethan, can you hear me?" he called, his hands gripping the boy's shoulders gently but firmly. Ethan's small body remained still for a moment longer, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then his eyelids fluttered open, slowly at first, as though the effort were immense. His dark eyes, normally so full of life, were glassy and distant, yet they locked onto the ceiling with an intensity that froze everyone in the room. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, he's awake!" she cried, a mixture of relief and terror in her voice. But it was not the kind of awakening they had hoped for. Ethan's face contorted into an expression no child should ever wear, a look of profound anguish mixed with something darker, something alien. His small hands twitched at his sides, and his lips began to move, forming words too faint to hear at first. Father Matthew stepped closer, his face a mask of concern and caution. "Ethan," he said gently, his voice steady but edged with unease. "Can you hear me, son? Are you in pain?" The boy's lips continued to move, but the sounds that emerged were not his own. It was a guttural, rasping voice that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the room. The words were unintelligible at first, a strange amalgamation of syllables that seemed to defy the rules of language. Then, as the voice grew stronger, the words became clearer, their meaning unmistakable. "They are coming," Ethan rasped, his voice low and echoing, as though it came from somewhere far beyond his small frame. His head turned slightly, his unblinking eyes now fixed on Father Matthews. "You cannot stop them." Sarah clutched Mark's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is he saying? Mark, what's happening to him?" Mark had no answer. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, but nothing could account for what they were witnessing. This was beyond the realm of medicine, beyond anything he had ever believed possible. His legs felt like they might give out beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright, to stay strong for Sarah, and for Ethan. Father Matthews took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had encountered strange and unsettling occurrences during his years in the priesthood, but this was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Ethan," he said firmly, leaning closer to the boy, "you're safe here. No one can hurt you. Who is coming? What do you mean?" Ethan's face twisted further, his voice rising in a cacophony of tones, some high-pitched, others guttural, as though multiple voices were speaking through him at once. "The gates are open," he said, his voice vibrating with a chilling resonance. "He watches and he waits." The temperature in the room plummeted further, the cold now biting against their skin. The heart monitor emitted another sharp beep, its rhythm erratic and frantic. Sarah sobbed openly, her tears falling onto Ethan's hand as she clung to it desperately. "Please stop," she cried, her voice breaking. "You're scaring him. You're scaring us." Father Matthews turned to her, his expression grave but controlled. "Sarah, stay calm," he urged. "I need you to trust me. Whatever this is, it's not your son. He's still in there, but something else is trying to speak through him." The words felt surreal as they left his mouth, yet they carried a certainty that left no room for doubt. Mark looked at the priest, his face pale and drawn. "What do you mean? What's happening to him? Is he possessed?" His voice cracked on the last word, the very idea too horrifying to comprehend. Father Matthews didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to Ethan, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy. He reached into the pocket of his cassock, pulling out a small vial of holy water. He uncapped it with practiced precision and dabbed a few drops onto his fingers before tracing the sign of the cross on Ethan's forehead. The reaction was immediate. Ethan's body arched violently off the bed, a guttural scream ripping from his throat. The lights in the room flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The heart monitor flatlined for a moment before resuming its erratic beeping. "Father, stop!" Sarah screamed, trying to reach for Ethan, but Mark held her back, his own terror visible in the tremor of his hands. "You have to let him do this," Mark said, though his voice was filled with doubt. Father Matthews pressed on, his voice rising as he began a series of prayers in Latin. His words carried an authority that seemed to cut through the chaos, though the struggle was palpable. Ethan's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head as the unearthly voice continued to speak, spitting words of anger and warning. "You cannot save him," it growled. "He belongs to us now." The priest's voice grew louder, his prayers unwavering. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he recited, his tone resolute. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Before he could finish, Ethan's body fell limp on the bed, the voice ceasing abruptly. The room was plunged into silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The lights steadied, and the oppressive chill began to dissipate. For a moment, no one moved. Sarah collapsed into Mark's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, while Father Matthews stood frozen, his breathing heavy. Ethan lay still, his face peaceful once more, as though nothing had happened. But the weight of what they had just witnessed lingered heavily in the air, a silent reminder that this was far from over. The silence in the room was deafening. Father Matthews remained still, his hand gripping the silver cross around his neck as he tried to process what had just occurred. He had faced many trials in his years of service. Grief-stricken families, crises of faith, even moments of doubt in his own beliefs. But nothing had prepared him for this. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain composure for the sake of the family. He had to be their anchor, even if his own faith had been shaken to its core. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Her voice was a trembling whisper, barely audible over the steady beeping of the heart monitor. "What just happened?" she asked, her tear-streaked face turning to Father Matthews. "What was that? That wasn't my son. That couldn't have been my Ethan." Mark held her tightly, his own face pale and drawn. "Father," he said, his voice hoarse, "you need to tell us what's going on. Is this something unnatural? Was that some kind of possession?" Father Matthews exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on Ethan's peaceful, lifeless face. "I don't want to alarm you," he began cautiously, his voice measured and calm. "But what we experienced here is not something I can easily explain. There are forces in this world, forces that we don't fully understand. Sometimes, in moments of great vulnerability, such as when a soul is nearing the veil between life and death, those forces can manifest." Sarah shook her head violently, her tears spilling anew. No, she sobbed. "This isn't happening. My son is innocent. He's just a boy. He wouldn't..." Her words broke into incoherent cries as she collapsed against Mark's chest. Mark stroked her hair, his own fear barely contained. "But what does it mean?" he asked the priest. "What does it want? Why did it say he belongs to them? Who are they?" Father Matthews tightened his grip on the cross, the familiar weight of it grounding him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with sincerity. But the words it spoke were deliberate. They weren't random, and they weren't just meant to frighten us. There's a message here, and we need to discern its meaning before we can act. He stepped closer to Ethan's bed, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy's face. Ethan's features were serene, as though he were merely sleeping, but there was a faint pallor to his skin that unsettled the priest. Gently, Father Matthews touched the boy's hand, noting how cold it was despite the warmth of the room. "Ethan is still here," he said softly. "I can feel his presence, but whatever force spoke through him is still lingering, like a shadow over his soul." Sarah let out a strangled cry, clutching her stomach as though she had been physically struck. "You're saying he's possessed?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "That he's being taken by demons? Is that what you're saying?" "I'm saying we don't know yet," Father Matthews replied firmly, meeting her frantic gaze. "But I've seen similar cases before, though none quite like this. Sometimes, when a person is on the brink of death, their soul becomes vulnerable. It's possible that something malevolent is trying to take advantage of Ethan's condition. But it's also possible that this is a test, a trial of faith, meant to challenge us all." Mark's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his protective instincts flaring. "If this is some kind of test, then how do we pass it? How do we save our son?" Father Matthews hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "We begin with prayer," he said at last. "Prayer, faith, and vigilance. But we may need to call upon others, experts in matters like these. There are rituals, rites, that can be performed to cleanse a soul or drive out any dark presence. However, those rites are not without risk." "Risk?" Sarah echoed, her voice trembling. "What kind of risk? He's already dying. What more could possibly happen?" Father Matthews stepped closer, his expression somber. "Sometimes these forces fight back. They don't leave willingly. And when they do, The person they're attached to may suffer, physically, emotionally, even spiritually. But if we do nothing, the consequences could be far worse. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, pressing down on everyone in the room. Sarah and Mark exchanged a long, anguished look, their love for their son etched into every line of their faces. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice filled with both fear and determination. "Do whatever you have to do. Just bring him back to us. Please." Father Matthews nodded solemnly. "I'll do everything in my power," he promised. "But first, I need to know more. Did anything unusual happen before Ethan fell ill? Any strange occurrences, unexplained events, or changes in his behavior?" Mark frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "No, nothing like that," he said. "He was a happy, normal kid. He started feeling sick a few months ago, and the doctors thought it was just a flu at first, but then it got worse, and they couldn't figure out why. They said it was some kind of rare autoimmune disease, but even with all their treatments, he just kept getting weaker." Sarah wiped her eyes, her voice raw as she added, "There was one thing, but it probably doesn't mean anything. A few weeks before he got sick, he had this nightmare. He said there was a man in his room, standing at the foot of his bed. He said the man didn't have a face, just darkness where his face should be. He was terrified, but we thought it was just a bad dream." Father Matthew's expression darkened, his mind racing. "Did he say anything else about the man? Did he describe him further, or mention anything the man might have said?" Sarah shook her head. "No, he just cried and said the man was watching him. We stayed with him that night until he fell asleep, and he didn't bring it up again." The priest's grip on his cross tightened. He had heard stories like this before, accounts of shadowy figures, malevolent entities that preyed on the weak and the vulnerable. It was no coincidence that the boy's illness had followed so soon after the nightmare. "This could be significant," he said gravely. "Sometimes these entities appear in dreams as a way of establishing a connection. They prey on fear, using it to gain a foothold." Sarah's face crumpled as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. "What does it want from him? He's just a little boy. Why would something like this go after him?" Father Matthews placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I believe Ethan is stronger than whatever is trying to harm him. And with faith, love, and determination, we can help him fight." As he spoke, the room seemed to grow colder once more, and the faint sound of a distant whisper reached their ears. Father Matthews turned toward the bed, his eyes narrowing. "Stay close to each other," he said firmly, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Whatever happens next, do not let go of your faith." The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the beeping of the heart monitor grew faint, as though the air itself had grown heavier. The battle for Ethan's soul was far from over, and Father Matthews knew that the true test had only just begun. Father Matthews stepped back from Ethan's bed, his mind racing. The cold air around them wasn't merely a physical phenomenon, it was a manifestation of something far darker, a presence that had settled in the room and refused to leave. He reached into his cassock and retrieved a small, leather-bound prayer book. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, though his resolve remained firm. This was not the first time he had confronted such forces, though it was unlike anything he had ever encountered before. Sarah and Mark watched him with a mix of hope and terror. The weight of their son's life, and perhaps his soul, now rested in the hands of this man who had arrived as a stranger but quickly become their only beacon of light in the suffocating darkness. As Father Matthews began to pray aloud, his voice filled the room, steady and deliberate. The words were ancient, Latin verses that had been passed down through centuries of faith. The cadence of his voice was rhythmic, almost melodic, as he recited the prayers with the kind of confidence born of years of devotion. But even as he prayed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something malevolent and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. The temperature dropped again, more sharply this time, and the lights flickered once more. The beeping of the heart monitor became erratic, each sharp tone cutting through the priest's prayers like a warning. Sarah clutched Mark's arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Ethan, who remained eerily still, his face unnaturally pale. Then, without warning, Ethan's body jolted upright, his small frame stiff and rigid as though he were a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Sarah screamed, her voice filled with raw terror, and Mark lunged forward instinctively, only for Father Matthews to hold him back with surprising strength. "Don't touch him," the priest commanded, his voice firm but calm. "Whatever is happening, it's not him. He's still in there, but this isn't him." Ethan's eyes snapped open, and they were no longer the eyes of a child. They glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly yellow hue that seemed to pulse and flicker like a dying flame. His head turned slowly, unnaturally, until his gaze locked onto Father Matthews. The priest felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow, a force pressing down on him, testing his resolve. "Why do you interfere?" Ethan's voice rasped, but it was not the voice of a child. It was deep, guttural, and layered, as though multiple voices were speaking in unison. "He is ours. You cannot save him." Sarah collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, while Mark stood frozen, his face pale and his body trembling. Father Matthews, however, stood his ground, clutching his prayer book tightly as he continued to recite the ancient verses. His voice grew louder, more commanding, as he pushed back against the entity's words. "You have no claim here," the priest said, his voice ringing with authority. "This child is a child of God, and you will release him. You have no power in this place." Ethan's lips curled into a twisted smile, and a low, guttural laugh filled the room. "You think your words have power over me?" the voice taunted. "Your prayers are meaningless. He is already mine." The shadows in the room began to writhe, twisting and stretching as though they had a life of their own. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. The heart monitor emitted a high-pitched, continuous beep, signaling that Ethan's heart had stopped, but his body remained upright, his glowing eyes locked on the priest. Father Matthews pressed forward, stepping closer to the bed despite the oppressive force that seemed to push against him. "You are a liar," he said, his voice unwavering. "You have no dominion here. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child." As he spoke, he reached for the vial of holy water at his side and uncorked it. He splashed a small amount onto Ethan's forehead, tracing the sign of the cross as he did so. The reaction was immediate and violent. Ethan's body convulsed, his back arching as an unearthly scream tore from his throat. The sound was deafening, a mixture of rage and agony that seemed to shake the very walls of the room. The shadows recoiled, retreating briefly before surging forward again with renewed fury. The lights flickered wildly, casting the room in a strobe-like effect that made it difficult to focus. Sarah and Mark clung to each other, their fear palpable, as Father Matthews continued his prayers, his voice rising above the chaos. "Begone, unclean spirit," he commanded, his words laced with a fierce determination. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I cast you out. You have no power here." Ethan's body writhed on the bed, his limbs twisting unnaturally as the entity within him fought back. The glowing light in his eyes flickered, dimming slightly as the priest's prayers gained strength. The shadows in the room seemed to thin, their oppressive presence beginning to wane, but the battle was far from over. The voice that had spoken through Ethan grew more desperate, its tone shifting from mocking to enraged. "You will suffer for this," it snarled. "You cannot protect him. You cannot protect yourself." Father Matthews ignored the taunts, his focus unshaken. He dipped his fingers into the holy water once more, sprinkling it across Ethan's chest and forehead as he continued his prayers. The boy's screams grew louder, more guttural, but the priest did not falter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan's body collapsed back onto the bed, limp and motionless. The glowing light in his eyes faded, replaced by their natural brown hue, and the heart monitor resumed its steady beeping. The oppressive chill in the room began to lift, and the flickering light steadied, casting a soft, steady glow. For a moment, no one moved. The room was filled with the sound of heavy breathing, the echoes of the battle still lingering in the air. Father Matthews stepped back, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken. He clutched his cross tightly, offering a silent prayer of thanks. Sarah and Mark rushed to Ethan's side, their hands trembling as they touched his face, his hands, his chest. "He's breathing," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "He's alive." Mark looked up at Father Matthews, his eyes brimming with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaking. "Thank you for saving him." But Father Matthews's face remained somber. He knew the battle was not truly over. Whatever force had claimed Ethan was still out there, waiting, watching. And he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The calm that settled over the hospital room was fragile, like the eye of a storm. Sarah and Mark stayed by Ethan's side, their hands trembling as they touched his cheeks, his arms, reassuring themselves that he was still alive. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was a lifeline, a sound they thought they might never hear again. Ethan's breaths were shallow but rhythmic, his small chest rising and falling as if he was simply in a deep sleep. Father Matthews stood a few feet away, leaning against the wall. He was visibly exhausted, his usually composed demeanor shaken. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the silver cross around his neck. His lips moved in silent prayer, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. Whatever had taken hold of Ethan wasn't gone, it had simply retreated. He could feel it, lingering just beyond the edges of the room, waiting. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice trembling. "Father, is he going to be okay now?" Her words were filled with hope, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She searched his face for reassurance, for something solid to hold onto in the chaos. Father Matthews hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He's resting now," he said softly. "For the moment, the danger has passed. But I won't lie to you. This isn't over. What we witnessed tonight was only the beginning of something much larger. That presence, that entity, it's still out there. It hasn't given up." Mark's jaw clenched, his protective instincts flaring. "What does that mean? Is it going to come back for him? For us?" His voice was sharp, tinged with anger and fear. "It's possible," Father Matthews admitted, his gaze steady. "Whatever it was, it made its intentions clear. It claimed Ethan as its own, and it won't let go easily. But there's hope. As long as we remain vigilant and keep our faith strong, we can protect him." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Why him?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why our son? He's just a little boy. He's never done anything to deserve this." Father Matthews approached her, his expression compassionate but serious. "Evil doesn't choose its victims based on fairness or deservingness," he said. "Sometimes it targets the purest among us because their light threatens its darkness. Ethan's innocence and spirit may be why this thing is so determined to claim him." Mark put a protective arm around Sarah, pulling her close. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice firm. "How do we keep him safe?" The priest straightened, his resolve returning. "First, we pray. Faith will be your strongest weapon in the days to come. I'll help you fortify your home, bless it, and ensure that there are no openings for this entity to return. But we may need to involve others, exorcists who are trained specifically for this kind of battle. What we faced tonight was powerful, and we'll need more than just one man's prayers to fight it." Sarah's face crumpled, and she buried her head in Mark's chest. "I don't understand any of this," she sobbed. "It feels like a nightmare, like we're trapped in some horrible story that we can't wake up from." Mark kissed the top of her head, his voice low but steady. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said. "Anything to keep him safe. Just tell us what to do." Before Father Matthews could respond, a faint noise interrupted the moment. It was a low, rumbling sound, so soft at first that it could have been mistaken for the hum of the hospital's ventilation system. But it grew steadily louder, more defined, until it was unmistakable. A guttural growl, distant yet piercing. The priest froze, his head snapping toward the door. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Sarah and Mark nodded, their eyes wide with fear. The growl seemed to reverberate through the walls, as if the very foundation of the building were groaning under some unseen weight. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. Father Matthews approached the door cautiously, his hand gripping the cross tightly. He opened it a crack and peered into the hallway. The corridor was empty, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital. But there was a strange stillness to it, as if the air itself had thickened. "What is it?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest stepped back into the room and closed the door firmly, locking it. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice grim. "But it's a reminder that whatever we're dealing with, it hasn't gone far. It's watching us." Ethan stirred slightly on the bed, letting out a small, fragile moan. Sarah rushed to his side, brushing his hair away from his face. "Ethan, sweetheart, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. The boy's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, his gaze focused on his mother. "Mum?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and weak. Sarah let out a choked sob of relief, her hands cupping his face. "Yes, baby, I'm here. We're here." Ethan's gaze drifted to Father Matthews, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "The man in my room," he murmured, his voice trailing off. Sarah stiffened, her heart sinking. "What man?" she asked gently. Ethan's eyes welled up with tears. "The man with no face," he whispered, He was here again. He said he's coming back. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched, his voice trembling with anger. "He's not coming back," he said firmly. "We won't let him." Father Matthews placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his expression resolute. "He's right," the priest said. "We won't let him, but we need to act quickly. Whatever this entity is, it's persistent and it's powerful. It's not just after Ethan, it's trying to break all of you. Fear, despair, anger. These are the cracks it will try to exploit." Sarah wiped her tears and looked up at the priest, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "What do we need to do?" Father Matthews took a deep breath, his mind already formulating a plan. "We need to fortify this room first," he said. "Then we'll prepare your home. I'll contact the diocese and request an exorcist with experience in cases like this. We'll surround Ethan with as much spiritual protection as possible." He turned to Ethan, who was drifting back into a light sleep. "And most importantly," he added, "we'll make sure he knows he's not alone. Whatever happens, he needs to feel safe, loved, and protected. That will be his strongest shield." As the priest spoke, a faint shadow seemed to flicker in the corner of the room, gone so quickly it could have been a trick of the light. But Father Matthews saw it, and his grip on the cross tightened. The battle was far from over, and he knew that what lay ahead would test not only his faith, but the strength of this family's bond. But he also knew one thing for certain. He would not let this entity claim the boy. Not while he still had breath in his body.